The Dilettante by Edith Wharton. It was on an impulse hardly needing the arguments he found himself advancing in its favour that Thursdale, on his way to the club, burned as usual into Mrs. Vervain's street. The as usual was his own qualification of the act, a convenient way of bridging the interval, in days and other sequences, that lay between this visit and the last. It was characteristic of him that he instinctively excluded his call 2 days earlier, with Ruth Gaynor, from the list of his visits to Mrs. Vervain. The special conditions attending it had made it no more like a visit to Mrs. Vervain than an engraved invitation is like a personal letter. Yet it was to talk over his call with Miss Gaynor, and he was now returning to the scene of that episode, and it was because Mrs. Vervain could be trusted to handle the talking over as skilfully as the interview itself that, at her corner, he had felt the dilettante's irresistible craving to take a last look at a work of art that was passing out of his possession. On the whole, he knew no one better fitted to deal with the unexpected than Mrs. Vervain. She excelled in the rare art of taking things for granted, and Thursdale felt a pardonable pride in the thought that she owed her excellence to his training. Early in his career Thursdale made the mistake, at the outset of his acquaintance with a lady, of telling her that he loved her and exacting the same avowal in return. The latter part of that episode had been like the long walk back from a picnic when one has to carry all the crockery one has finished using. It was the last time Thursdale ever allowed himself to be encumbered with the debris of a feast. He thus incidentally learned that the privilege of loving her is one of the least favours that a charming woman can accord, and in seeking to avoid the pitfalls of sentiment, he had developed a science of evasion, in which the woman of the moment became a mere implement of the game. He owed a great deal of delicate enjoyment to the cultivation of this art. The perils from which it had been his refuge became naively harmless. Was it possible that he who now took his easy way along the levels had once preferred to gasp on the raw heights of emotion? Youth is a height-coloured season, and he had the satisfaction of feeling that he had entered earlier than most into that chorizo of sensation where every half-tone has its value. As a promoter of the pleasure no one had known was comparable to Mrs. Vervain. He had taught a good many women not to betray their feelings, but he had never before had such fine material to work in. She had been surprisingly crude when he first knew her, capable of making the most awkward inferences, of plunging through thin ice, of recklessly undressing her emotions, but she had acquired, under the discipline of his reticence and evasions, a skill almost equal to his own, and perhaps more unremarkable in that it involved keeping time with any tune he played and reading at some uncommonly difficult passages. It had taken Thursdale 7 years to form this fine talent, and the result justified the effort. At the crucial moment she had been perfect. Her way of greeting Miss Gaynor had made him regret that he had announced his engagement by letter. It was an evasion that confessed a difficulty, a deviation implying an obstacle where, by common consent, it was agreed to see none. It betrayed, in short, a lack of confidence in the completeness of his method. It had his pride never to put himself in a position which had to be acquitted, as it were, by the back door. But here, as he perceived, the main portals would have opened for him on their own accord. All this, and much more, he read in finished naturalness, which with Mrs. Vervain had met Mrs. Gaynor. He had never seen a better piece of work. There was no over-eagerness, no suspicious warmth. Above all, and this gave her art the grace of a natural quality. There were none of those damnable implications whereby a woman is welcoming to her friend's betrothed. Many keep him on pins and needles, while she laps the lady in complacency. So masterfully a performance, indeed, hardly needed the offset of Miss Gaynor's doorstep words. To be so kind to me, how she must have liked you, though he caught himself wishing it lay within the bounds of fitness to transmit them, as a final tribute, to the one woman he knew was unfailingly certain to enjoy a good thing. It was perhaps the one drawback to this new situation, that it might develop good things which it would be impossible to hand on to Margaret Vervain. The fact that he had made the mistake of underrating his friend's powers, the consciousness that his writing must have betrayed his distrust of her efficiency, seemed an added reason for turning down her street instead of going on to the club. He would show her that he knew how to value her. He would ask her to achieve with him a feat infinitely rarer and more delicate than the one he had appeared to avoid. Incidentally, he would also dispose of the interval of time before dinner. Ever since he had seen Miss Gaynor off, an hour earlier, on her return journey to Buffalo, he had been wondering how he should put it in the rest of the afternoon. It was absurd how he missed the girl. Yes, that was it. The desire to talk about her was, as, after all, at the bottom of his impulse to call on Mrs. Vervain. It was absurd, if you like, but it was delightfully rejuvenating. He could recall the time when he had been afraid of being obvious. Now he felt that his return to the primitive emotions might be as restorative as a holiday in the Canadian woods, and it was precisely by the girl's candor, her directness, her lack of complications, that he was taken. The sense that she might say something rash at any moment was positively exhilarating. If she had thrown her arms about him at the station, he would not have given a thought to his crumpled dignity. It surprised Thursdale to find what freshness of heart he brought to the adventure, and though a sense of irony prevented his ascribing his intactness to any conscious purpose, he could but rejoice in the fact that his sentimental economies had left him such a large surplus to draw upon. Mrs. Vervain was at home, as usual. When one visits the cemetery, one expects to find the angel on the tombstone, and it struck Thursdale as another proof of his friend's good taste that she had been in no undue haste to change her habits. The whole house appeared to count on his coming. The footman took his hat and overcoat as naturally as though there had been no lapse in his visits, and the drawing-room at once enveloped him in that atmosphere of tacit intelligence which Mrs. Vervain imparted to her very furniture. It was a surprise that, in this general harmony of circumstances, Mrs. Vervain should herself sound the first false note. "You!" she exclaimed, and the book she held slipped from her hand. It was crude, certainly, unless you were a touch of the finest art. The difficulty of classifying it disturbed Thursdale's balance. "Why not?" he said, restoring the book. "Isn't it my hour?" And she made no answer. He added gently, "Unless it's some one else's." She laid the book aside and sank back into her chair. "Mine, merely," she said. "I hope that doesn't mean you're unwilling to share it with you. By no means. You're welcome to my last crust." He looked at her reproachfully. "Do you call this the last?" She smiled as he dropped into a seat across the hearth. "It's a way of giving it more flavor." He returned the smile. "A visit to you doesn't need such condiments." She took this with just the right measure of retrospective amusement. "Ah, but I want to put into this one a very special taste," she confessed. Her smile was so confident, so reassuring, that it lulled him into the imprudence of saying, "Why should you want it to be different from what was always so perfectly right?" She hesitated. "Doesn't the fact that it was the last constitute a difference? The last, my last visit to you? Well, metaphorically, I mean. There's a break in the continuity." Decidedly, she was pressing too hard, unlearning his arts already. I don't recognize it, he said, unless you make me. He added with a note that slightly stirred her attitude of languid attention. She turned to him with grave eyes. You recognize no difference whatsoever, none except an added link in the chain, an added link, and having one more thing to like you for. You're letting Miss Gaynor see why I had already so many. He flattered himself that this turn had taken the least hint of fatuity from the phrase. Mrs. Vervain sank into her former easy pose. Was it that you came for? She asked almost gaily. It is necessary. If it is necessary to have a reason, that was one. To talk to me about Mrs. Gaynor, tell you how she talks about you. That you will be very interesting, especially if you have seen her since her second visit to me. Her second visit. Thursdale pushed his chair back with a start, and moved to another. She came to see you again this morning, yes, by appointment. He continued to look at her blankly. You sent for her? I didn't have to. She wrote and asked me last night. But no doubt you have seen her since. Thursdale sat silent. He was trying to separate his words from his thoughts, but they still clung together inextricably. I saw her off just now at the station, and she didn't tell you that she had been here again. There was hardly time, I suppose. There was hardly people about. You flounder. Ah, she'll write then. He regained his composure. Of course she'll write, very often, I hope. You know I'm absurdly in love, he cried audaciously. She tilted her head back, looking up at him as he leaned against the chimney-piece. He leaned there so often that the attitude touched a pulse which set throbbing to her throat. Oh, my poor Thursdale, she murmured. I suppose it's rather ridiculous, he owned, and as she remained silent, he added with a sudden break, or have you another reason for pitying me? Her answer was another question. Have you been back to your rooms since you left her? Since I left her at the station, I came straight here. Ah, yes, you could. There was no other reason. Her words passed into a silent musing. Thursdale moved nervously nearer. You said you had something to tell me. Perhaps I had better let her do so. There may be a letter in your rooms. A letter? What do you mean? A letter from her? What has happened? His paleness shook her, and she raised a hand of reassurance. Nothing has happened. Perhaps that is just the worst of it. You always hated, you know, she added incoherently, to have things happen. You never would let them, and now. Well, that was what she came here for. I suppose you had guessed. To know if anything had happened. Happened, he gazed at her slowly. Between you and me? He said with a rush of light. The words were so much cruder than any that had ever passed between them, and the color rose to her face, but she held his startled gaze. You know girls are not quite as unsophisticated as they used to be. Are you surprised that such an idea should occur to her? His own color answered hers. It was the only reply that came to him. Mrs. Vervain went on smoothly. I suppose it might have struck you that there were times when we presented that appearance. He made an impatient gesture. A man's past is his own. Perhaps it certainly never belongs to the woman who has shared it. But one learns such truth only by experience, and Miss Gaynor is naturally inexperienced. Of course, but supposing her act is a natural one, he floundered lamentably among his innuendos. I still don't see how there was anything to take hold of. There wasn't. Well then, escaped him in crude satisfaction. But as she did not complete the sentence, he went on with a faltering laugh. She can hardly object to the existence of a mere friendship between us. But she does, says Mrs. Vervain. Thursdale stood perplexed. He had seen on the previous day no trace of jealousy or resentment in the betrothed. He could still hear the candid ring of the girl's praise of Mrs. Vervain. If she were such an abyss of insincerity as to disassemble trust under such frankness. She must at least be more subtle than to bring her doubts to her rival for solution. The situation seemed one through which one could no longer move in a penumbra, and he let in a burst of light with a direct query. "Won't you explain what you mean?" Mrs. Vervain sat silent, not provokingly, as though to prolong his distress, but as if in the attenuative phraseology he had taught her. It was difficult to find words robust enough to meet his challenge. It was the first time he had ever asked her to explain anything, and she had lived so long in dread of offering elucidations which were not wanted, that she seemed unable to produce one on the spot. And at last she said slowly, "She came to find out if you were really free." Thursdale colored again. "Free," he stammered, with a sense of physical disgust at contact in such crassness. "Yes, if I had done quite with you." She smiled in recovered security. "It seems she likes clear outlines. She has a passion for definitions." "Yes, well," he said, wincing at the echo of his own subtlety. "Well, and when I told her that you had never belonged to me, she wanted me to define my status, to know exactly where I had stood all along." Thursdale sat gazing at her intently. His hand was not yet on the clue. "And even when you had told her that, even when I had told her that I had no status, that I had never stood anywhere, in any sense, she meant," said Mrs. Vervain, slowly, "even when she wasn't satisfied, it seems." He uttered an uneasy exclamation. "She doesn't believe you, you mean?" "I mean that she did believe me too thoroughly." "Well then, in God's name, what did she want?" "Something more." Those were the words she used, "something more, between you and me." "Is it a conundrum?" He laughed awkwardly. "Girls are not always what they were in my day. They are no longer forbidden to contemplate the relation of the sexes." "So it seems," he commented. "But since in this case there wasn't any," he broke off, catching the dawn of the revelation in her gaze. "That's just it. The pardonable offense has been in our not offending." He flung himself down despairingly. "I gave it up." "What did you tell her?" he burst out with a sudden crudeness. "The exact truth. If I had only known." She broke off with a beseeching tenderness. "Won't you tell that I would still have lied for you, lied for me? Why on earth would you have lied for either of us? To save you, to hide you from her to the last, as I have hidden you from myself in these years." She stood up with a sudden tragic import in her movement. "You believe me capable of that, don't you? If I had only guessed, but I have never known a girl like her. She had the truth out of me with a spring, the truth that you and I had never in all these years. Oh, she knew why. She measured us both in a flash. She didn't suspect me of having haggled with you." Her words pelted me like hail. "He just took what he wanted, sifted and sorted you to suit his taste, burnt out the gold and left a heap of cinders. And you let him. You let yourself be cut to bits," and she mixed her metaphors a little. "Be cut in bits, and used or discarded. Well, all the while every drop of blood in you belonged to him. But he's Shylock, and you have bled to death on the pound of flesh he has cut out of you. But she despised me the most, you know, far the most," Mrs. Vervain ended. The words strangely fell on the scented stillness of the room. They seemed out of harmony with its setting of afternoon intimacy, the kind of intimacy on which at any moment a visitor might intrude without perceptibly lowering the atmosphere. It was as though a grand opera singer had strained the acoustics of the private music room. Thursdale stood up, facing his hostess. Half the room was between them, but they seemed to stare close at each other, now that the veils of reticence and ambiguity had fallen. His first words were characteristic. "She does despise me, then," he exclaimed. "She thinks the pound of flesh that you took was a little too near the heart. It was excessively pale. Please tell me exactly what she said of me. She did not speak much of you. She is proud. But I gather that while she understands love or indifference, her eyes have never been opened to the many intermediate shades of feeling. At any rate, she expressed an unwillingness to be taken with reservations. She thinks you would have loved her better if you had loved someone else first. The point of view is original. She insists on a man with a past. What past? If she's serious, I could rake that up a past, he said with a laugh. So I suggested, but she has her eyes on this particular portion of it. She insists on making it a test case. She wanted just to know what you had done to me, and before I could guess her drift, I blundered into telling her. Thursdale drew a difficult breath. I never supposed your revenge was complete, he said slowly. He heard a little gasp in her throat. My revenge? When I sent for you to warn you, to save you from being as surprised as I was surprised. You're very good, but that's rather late to talk of saving me. He held out his hand in the mechanical gesture of leave-taking. How you must care, but I never saw you so dull, was her answer. Don't you see? That's not too late for me to help you. And as he continued to stare, she brought out sublimely, take the rest, in imagination, and let it at least be of that much use to you. Tell her I lied to you. She's too ready to believe it. And after all, in a sense, I shan't have been wasted. His stare hung on her, widening to a kind of wonder. She gave the look to the back brightly, unblushingly, as though the expedient were too simple to need oblique approaches. It was extraordinary how few words had swept from the atmosphere of the most complex dissimulations to the contact of naked souls. It was not in Thursdale to expand the pressure of fate, but something in him cracked with it, and the rift left him in a new light. He went up to his friend and took her hand. You would do it, and she looked at him, smiling, but her hand shook. Goodbye, he said, kissing it. Goodbye. You are going to get my letter. Your letter. The letter won't matter. If you will only do what I ask. He returned her gaze. I suppose, without being out of character. Only, don't you see that if it's your plan to help me, it could only harm her. The sacrifice you would make me different. I shall go on being what I always have been, sifting and sorting, as she calls it. Do you want my punishment to fall on her? She looked at him long and deeply. If I had to choose between you would let her take her chance, but I can't. You see, I must take my punishment alone. She drew her hand away, sighing. Oh, there will be no punishment for either of you. For either of us, there will be reading of her letter for me. She shook her head with a silent laugh. There will be no letter. Thursdale faced about from the threshold with fresh life in his look. No letter, you don't mean? I mean, she's been with you since I saw her. She's seen you and heard your voice. If there is a letter, she has recalled it from the first station by telegraph. He turned back to the door, forcing an answer to her smile. But in the meanwhile, I shall have read it, he said. The door closed on him, and she hid her eyes from the dreadful emptiness of the room. And that's the end of The Dilettante by Edith Wharton. Yeah, I like that story. I'm like half asleep right now because I'm about to go to sleep. But I don't really understand what happened. I have really bad reading comprehension skills. I say that at the end of every video. I have really bad reading comprehension skills. That means I'm not good at reading. It means I'm not good at analysis. I couldn't really tell you what that story was about or what the meaning of the story is or whatever. However, I am reading this stuff to try to get better at reading because I think it's important to educate yourself and try to make yourself smarter. That's just what I think. Let me know in the comments below, what do you think of the story. Please subscribe to this channel to be part of the community. And please like this video. It really helps out the channel a lot. Thank you for watching. Have a great day. Bye-bye.